Okay, folks. That's right, all 20 of you. You've learned about the innermost workings of light. You've seen things that you might have wished you hadn't seen. And even worse, you've sat through my shitty jokes. But the journey is not over yet. In fact, we're just getting started. The fun part is about to begin. Alright, I think I'm done talking about the K-pop boys. But even though that reference was pretty muted, and I just slandered saturated colors, that doesn't mean you have to completely stay away from them, or that you can't break these lighting rules. I mean, this isn't a math class. Unless... No. But there are many ways to make your colors interesting through color stylization. You're completely free to exaggerate the hues and saturation when it comes to lighting, and in my opinion, that's the better approach, rather than only choosing colors on the basis of whether it would be realistic or not. But of course, having some base knowledge about how this stuff works in real life helps. Hence the long-ass video before this. If we were to look at a prominent example of this exaggeration, we can look no further than to the man himself, Samdoesarts. His use of color is super playful and lively, and takes full advantage of interesting lighting schemes. Take for instance this image. When compared to the original reference photo, it's clear that there's some color exaggeration going on. Mr. Does Arts is amping up not only the saturation of these light sources and the objects they hit, but also the intensity. This is especially visible in the hair, where shapes caused by light are almost crisper, while the original's light from the sun is much more diffused. You can even see a clear differentiation between the warm highlights caused by the sun and the cool highlights caused by the sky. I would 100% recommend doing a study of his work. However, amping up the saturation and intensity of colors isn't the only way to bring something special to your work. Allow me to introduce color notes. To do what I do best, and explain this in the best way possible, color notes are basically notes of color. As you can tell, I'm a bit of a terminology genius. When making use of color notes, you're basically just adding color variation, while keeping in mind the local color, value, and temperature of what you're shading. The key here is that you don't stray too far from these original properties. For instance, if you take this blue background from the ball example of my previous video, you can add color notes by adding hints of other colors, with varying intensities. Just keep in mind that when adding hints of warmer colors, this is really just desaturating the blue to varying degrees, but in contrast, it looks warmer. As long as you do this, adding that warmer color in its full intensity, the overall color temperature of that object will stay the same. Just like you, failing to get hot even after puberty. It's also good to remember that when zoomed out, you should still be able to tell what the original color and saturation was, depending on what kind of look you're going for. So don't go overboard. And lastly, make sure that the values you choose for your color notes are similar, if not the same, to the original, so that it still looks cohesive. It can be tough to estimate the approximate value of color, especially if you're not used to thinking of colors as having three distinct but connected qualities. However, in time, it's something that you'll get used to. When it's done right, color notes can bring a lot of variety and interest to your painting. Another good opportunity for including these notes is if you were to do a study of the reference photo from earlier. In this photo, all of the colors are in the gray family, yet it could still make for an insanely interesting painting, because there are a lot of opportunities for color variation. In fact, grayish areas of a painting are the best parts to include color notes, as it's a natural transition from color to color, even if they're on opposite sides of the color wheel. Connecting back to the passing through gray method I was talking about earlier. If you look at this guy's shirt especially, There are opportunities all over to add patches of green, blue, yellow, and brown tones. Even in his skin, there are opportunities to add color notes. Really, it's all up to your personal taste and creativity. Now, you'll notice that Mr. Doesarts himself doesn't really use color notes, as they can add an element of chaos to a painting, while his art is usually extremely clean. Uncannily clean, you could even say. Really, it's all up to personal preference and style. There's nothing wrong with using as much or as little of these two types of exaggeration as you want. Though I would caution you, it's easy to get carried away in making shadows too saturated and making everything too colorful. When it comes to color notes, I would imagine that adding too many with too much intensity isn't great either. Sometimes subtlety is key, and that can be hard. Now, when you're picking your own references for study, especially in lighting, you should stay away from quote-unquote normal pictures. And when I say normal pictures, I'm talking about the pictures with the most basic bitch lighting scheme possible, like the diffused light example from my other video. This species of photo is abundant on social media, especially selfies of those pretty girls people love drawing, so just beware. These are mostly just terrible for beginners because, as I said earlier, subtlety is hard, and no high contrast shadows or interesting lighting schemes make it even harder to show form and not make your drawing look like shit. But this is getting more into value territory, and I want enough material for another video, so I'm gonna leave this conversation at that for now. To be honest, guys, I had more planned for this section, talking about layer modes and stuff. That you shouldn't be afraid of using them as a learning tool to simulate different colors in different lighting conditions. But then I realized that that advice could just be summed up in that one sentence. Damn. How the hell am I gonna make this video 10 minutes long now? Well, I guess there's one thing I could do for content. Against my better judgment, I decided against doing what I was gonna do. Instead, I've decided to do a demo of everything this and my last video has covered. It'll be less entertaining, but a more logical conclusion to this part of the series, I suppose. The things I sacrifice for education. In preparation, I made a sketch in advance, and refined it too, just for you guys. Not gonna lie, when I started, I struggled a lot, as you can see from the footage. For the most part, I kinda knew what I wanted to do with the lighting for this scene. A cliche kind of diagonal light source, with the harsh shadow caused by something overhead obstructing light. After a few failed attempts, I decided to just forget about that annoying chunk of sunlight and focus on the shadows. At this point, I decided to shade the girl like there's only one indirect light source, which was reflected light from the sky, almost as if it were overcast or something. My reasoning being that the overall lighting scheme for overcast days and the shadows in my hypothetical lighting scenario would be similar. For this part, I'm pretty much just adding colors normally, except making sure they don't stray too far from blue, and adding blue tinted light from directly overhead. Once I was done with that, I used the multiply layer to push the entire scene into darker shadow, to make room, I guess, for my real light source, the sun. Since I'm lazy, I mean extremely efficient, I just used a color dodge layer to get the color and temperature of the light how I wanted it. From there, it was really just adding highlights and darker shadows to the girl's clothes and hair according to where the light touched. The places the sunlight didn't touch, or the shadows, stayed lit by the previous overcast lighting scheme. When doing this, I kept in mind the fact that I needed to hue shift my base color to a slightly more warm or yellowish color for the highlights. I'm also gradually adding in ambient occlusion in places where I feel that not much light will reach. This mostly applies to small crevices, such as in various folds of her shirt or the sides of her neck. Something I also realized was missing was bounce light from the sunlight. While the sunlight doesn't directly touch anywhere above the girl's shoulder, it'll likely reflect off the girl's shirt or other highly lit objects in the painting, or so I figured. So I put some warm light on the bottom. Right? Left? Fuck. Well, the bottom of the girl's face. Well, on the bottom of the girl's face, where the reflected light will probably be the strongest. I also put some bounce light on her beanie and ear, the second of which I also tried to simulate subsurface scattering on. After that, I gave this girl a cast shadow and tried to add some color notes to the wall. Now, I think this is actually a good time to note how white, out of all the colors, is the most malleable. And what I mean by that is that, in this scene, though I don't really show it that well, the white background is going to reflect a lot of different colors from the surrounding objects and light sources, especially from the ground and sky. So it's important to keep in mind that, out of most things, objects that are white are often the most affected by ambient light, not counting mirrors. Lastly, it's good to note that throughout this entire underpainting, I've been greatly exaggerating the hues in my colors and light sources, maybe even to a silly extent, in order to give more interest to the piece. Not to compare myself to the masters, but like Samdoesarts, I'm also amping up the saturation of colors. Of course, you don't have to do this, but I've learned that it's an approach that usually works for me. Again, just know that if you're gonna increase the saturation, it's increasingly important to be mindful of color theory. And yeah, the rest of this is just the boring stuff. Smoothing out shading, painting over sketch lines, etc. Really, when it comes to color, the underpainting is the most important part, because that's where you establish what exactly you're gonna do. Your game plan, I guess you could say. Anyways, this is the finished product, or at least as finished as I can care to make it. And I think this wraps up the demo portion of this video. But really, even though this whole lighting thing is pretty intimidating, you don't have to take this all on at once. Hell, the best way to start is by taking a look outside your window, and taking some time to really observe everything around you, how light bounces off objects, etc. Through studies and observation, you can easily learn this stuff. It may be hard at first, but with practice, it'll come easy. Not that I'd know that for sure, but it's an educated guess. Just remember, there's more content coming, so like, comment, and subscribe.